Right, good evening everyone and welcome to this AgriLeader Staying Ahead of the Curve. Very good to have you here tonight. Tonight we're going to be focusing on operating in the new norm. We have a fantastic global insight from three phenomenal speakers, so really looking forward to that. My name is Izak Van Heerden and I'll be co-chairing the session with Mark Campbell, that you can see on the screen there. And between us, we put together the AgriLeader program at AHDB. Mark, so just looking down the list there, I reckon there's a few people that may be sort of new to AgriLeader. So if you can just remind us of what AgriLeader is and what is the benefits to be involved, please.
Great, thanks Isaac, and welcome everyone to this evening's Staying Ahead of the Curve session. So AgriLeader, it's a programme at AHDB where we are trying to basically create a community of like-minded farmers and growers to provide that platform where you can exchange ideas, learn from each other, and also have access to specialists from right around the world, as of tonight, from inside and outside of the industry. The programme is based on three core themes: so leading self, leading others, and leading business. And that's where we're going to go tonight. We're going to focus a little bit on the leading business element, but not completely explicitly. Through events like tonight, we hope to build this community. And in addition, a quick plug: on Thursday lunchtime at 11:30, we've got the launch of our new Talking Leaders session, which is going to be a short TED-type talk session with an individual called Tim Bradshaw, who's an ex-Marine Commando, and is going to tell us an interesting story about Because I Can and being on Everest in an earthquake. But we've got an amazing lineup this evening of speakers, which I won't dwell on that. And back to you, Isaac. Let's see where we can go.
Cheers, Mark. And I've got a bit of housekeeping, but actually everybody's so used to these kind of things now. So my first one was to please switch your cameras off, but you've all done that already, I think. And also, if you put yourself on mute, so that for the background noise. But you've already done that. We really want tonight to be interactive, to be live. So if you want to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat and we can ask on your behalf, or just put your hand up. We'll invite you onto the stage as such, at which point obviously switch your camera and your mic back on, and you can ask your question live to the panelist. If you don't want to do that, then just put it in the chat and we'll ask it on your behalf. So without further ado, our three panelists are, drum roll.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so to kick us off, we have Rob Ward. So Rob's food and farming industry experience spans from running one of the largest commercial soft fruit industries farms in the country, product design, innovation, and patenting the first commercial hydroponics field-scale strawberry growing system, which sounds extremely interesting. Following this, he applied his entrepreneurial skills to create and build a selling business ranging from grocery, retail, and wholesale distribution to the food and drink consumers, packaging goods, and a food tech business. So in 2018, Rob completed his Nuffield scholarship, during which he researched the future of innovating food industry, and today he both advises for the UK Department of Trade on futures of international agri-tech and business, and how this can lead the UK sector. He also runs his own business, specialising in discovering and developing the next generation of agricultural technology. So Rob, you can switch your camera on. Joining Rob on the panel, we have our own Phil Bicknell from AHDB, our Market Intelligence Director. He joined AHDB in 2017, having previously held a role of Head of Food and Farming at the National Farmers Union. Phil is an agricultural economist graduate from Reading and has worked in the agri-economic and food sector from British Potato Council, USDA, and Bidwell's. He was also the chief economist at the NFU before he was appointed head of farming, but now he heads up our market intelligence team. So Phil, if you can join us, and over to you, Isaac.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Jeff Grant. Jeff is from right down on the South Island in New Zealand, right at the bottom. Jeff's a sheep, beef and deer farmer, but also a former member of parliament. He's held company director and chairmanship positions with over 25 companies and organizations in the agribusiness sector since 1994. From 2018, Jeff spent 2 years at New Zealand House in London working on Brexit and the free trade agreements for New Zealand's meat industry until he had to go back to New Zealand with the COVID. Jeff is currently involved in the governance of land and water reforms, including impacts of climate change policy on New Zealand farming. So I guess Jeff has really seen it from both sides, from a farmer side, but also from the politics and the trade side. Excellent. So if you can join us on screen, please, Jeff. Excellent. Thank you very much. So Phil and Jeff has recorded their thoughts on staying ahead of the curve. We've asked them to just do a short video for us on their sort of main take-home messages. So we'll play that in a second, and then after that, Rob will give us his thoughts live. And after that, we'll get stuck into some good chunky live Q&A session. So if we can roll the video, please, Sammy.
Welcome to the AHDB Agri Leader panel debate. My name is Jeff Grant, here from New Zealand, once again to talk a bit about getting ahead of the curve. I thought I'd do it from a perspective of New Zealand agriculture and what's changed in the last 40 years here in New Zealand. And what are the things that we looked at as a collectively as an industry and individually on farm to try and deal with the impact of economic reform. So in New Zealand's case, you need to go right back to 1965. New Zealand was the 6th wealthiest country per capita in the OECD. By 1980, we'd dropped to 19th most prosperous country in the OECD, which was a dramatic change. 2 key areas. Inflation had got out of hand in New Zealand's economy, and the unemployment rates had gone well up to 10%. And so in 1984, we saw the start of an economic reforms led by the Labour government, which in the first dramatic round saw the removal of all agricultural subsidies through a budget process overnight. But in the context of what New Zealand was trying to achieve, we had come from quite a staid economy. Prior to 1984, we had wage freezes going, we had price freezing, we had manipulation of the capital markets and the exchange rate by the Reserve Bank in order to try and stop the inflationary impact on our economy. So the economy had run its course to a certain extent. Many would say New Zealand was actually effectively broke as a national economy by 1984. So those reforms, which then carried on for another 15 years, saw some big changes. So the public service in New Zealand became much more corporatised, some of it even being privatised. The ability to have more active labour market took place. The exchange rate was floated. Capital markets were reformed. And I think also significantly things like our ports that operated in quite a labour union organisation were dramatically changed and became much more efficient, much more active in terms of competitiveness, and also in the larger transport area, subsidies were removed, which made a complete difference in terms of the way future transport of our goods would take place. New Zealand agriculture being a country that 95% relies on its exports, obviously had to look to the export market as well. But it was a pretty tough time. So post 1984, you saw interest rates get up to about 17.5%, 18% for a mortgage on farm, something that I experienced for about the first 5 years of my farming career. You also saw the imposition of costs that had existed under the subsidised system. To give an example, processing of a lamb had jumped 22% in the previous year of 1984, just because of the subsidy mechanism that had operated historically in the New Zealand agricultural economy. So those pressures started to come to a point where farmers had to dramatically change. Firstly, they looked at their own costs on farm, so those variable costs like insurance, fertiliser, and also leases or contracting that they may have entered into were rapidly changed. Farmers went to the dramatic extent of saying, in order to survive, I won't put fertiliser on for the next 2 years to get my budget and my cash flow back into a position. Having lost between 30 and 40% of their net income because of subsidies, they had to move quite dramatically. I think the other area that we started to see some big changes to was that the compliance costs were forced to be addressed by the government. And so farmers drew quite strong, passionate demands of the government agencies about how the true costs of what they did and the impact they had. Local government rates, as an example, came under really big pressure by farming groups to ensure that the costs were a fair reflection on farming industries in terms of the way they could operate for the future. So the competitive costing started to take an impact through that period. And then on a macro level, New Zealand started to look at agriculture on the basis of research, how we could change the impact of that, and the push to see that there was a research body that gave a much more reflective of farmer improvement in terms of their economy going forward. The necessity of having to be able to get the sort of research that allowed for on-farm genetic gain was critical. So we saw a 30% increase in the productivity of sheep industry, as an example, over the period of 15 years. The increase in the land growth rates, the lambing percentages were increased quite dramatically from around 100% average nationally to 140%. And also the genetics in pasture and the composition of the pastures and rotational grazing saw our ability to produce 30% more on less actual capital stock on farms. This gave a significant buffer to farmers over that 15-year period of growth in order to survive going into the future. On farm, it was important also to be able to ensure that for the future, that the things that were being done were a viable aspect. And I must say, from a government perspective, through research and also advice, was an area that was well reflected in terms of farmers being able to survive. But the future's always a bit of a challenge, and we're about to enter into it again. New Zealand is going through some substantial land reforms, both in the water and land reform, biodiversity, and obviously climate change. And these will have a significant impact as we work towards looking what our markets will provide for the future. But the key driver through all this process was the consumer and the trends there. And I'm happy to talk in terms of some of the questions that might be asked about what those changes were, like the non-use of hormones in cattle, through to our ability to cut a carcass into 400 different cuts in order to meet consumer demand offshore. Look forward to having those conversations as part of the debate.
Right, so thinking about operating in the new norm. Well, look, for me, I think as an industry, we've got some major challenges heading our way. Farm policy change and the phase out of the basic payment scheme is going to be significant for many of us in the farming sector. The bottom line for the average livestock and arable farm looks very different when you remove those BPS payments and look just at the income from agricultural activity alone. I think we all know the future policy focus is going to be on environmental schemes. But right now, I think these are really difficult to plan for. I don't know how much is on offer or what the incentives will be. And I don't think any farm business can incorporate that into their forward thinking or their budgeting just yet. We know the government is actively pursuing trade deals with the USA, Australia and New Zealand. They're all at the front of that trade pipeline. The fact that we're actively pursuing free trade agreements really should be no surprise in a post-Brexit global Britain world. But the fact that those countries are 3 established and successful net exporters of agriculture agricultural and food products, well, doesn't make it particularly comforting from a farm business perspective. Now, much is made of our farming and our food standards in trade talks. That was particularly the case with the USA last year, and it's been similar with Australia in recent weeks as details have been picked up in the media and the press around the details of that potential trade deal. Standards are important. I agree 100% with the sentiment that products that has been produced to standards lower than ours should not be given access. If we do that, we just risk offshoring a proportion of our production. However, we also know that excluding products on the basis of how they've been produced is really a challenge under the World Trade Organization rules, and how we square that circle is going to be really critical. But we also need to anticipate that overseas competitors will work hard to meet whatever standards we put in place. We're talking here about countries who already meet a range of different standards and legal requirements in different markets. Bottom line is, if the rewards are there, they'll pivot production and processing to meet the standards that we impose. Standards won't exclude competition. Talking of standards, red tape is a regular complaint from us farmers, and I don't think it's going away. Today's high standards are tomorrow's baseline. I think that we will see more environment-related criteria, and I think in part that's going to be expected by our supply chains over time. We've also made much of our high standards. We need to be prepared to evidence that. And how we approach this, I think, is down to us as an industry. We all need to make sure that we view it more as a springboard for our reputation and our market positioning, rather than view it as a bit of a compliance headache. Now, it's not just about policy. We've experienced a very dry and cold April. That was followed by an exceptionally wet May. They're just a reminder of the ongoing challenges around climate and the increased frequency of weather events, and they impact on many of our farming sectors and many farming businesses. Now look, whatever your views on climate change, you can't argue with the numbers. And if we look back to the last 100 years, 7 of the 10 wettest years have occurred since 2000. If we look at the warmest years, well, the top 10 have all occurred since 2000. Now look, I've mentioned some pretty substantial topics in this. As an individual farmer, I can't directly influence those big issues. And it's not sensible to worry about the things that you can't control. Instead, focus on what is under your sphere of influence. Now, work that we've done at AHDB has identified some critical factors, all of which are within our gift, and that collectively they make a difference. Now, I'm not going to go through them all, but I do want to pull out some of those that I value most. First is around setting goals and budgets. Now, I hear the argument sometimes about, well, what's the point of trying to set budgets and develop plans when everything is so volatile? The simple answer with budgets and plans is things change, you update them. The more volatile the situation, even more reason to do them, I would argue. And if this is part of a strategic vision that helps with that clear decision making and has a clear focus on growing your business, well, that's even better. And I'd suggest that if you employ people in your farm business, or your farm business structure is anything other than a sole trader, actually having that plan and that shared vision is a key to leading and developing your business. Another aspect I think is important is about comparing yourself with others and gathering information. I think as farming businesses, we've never had so much data available to us, but we've got huge scope to use it more effectively and to drive decisions. We need to make sure that we are making decisions with our head over our heart. I think it's safe to say sometimes in our industry, it's the heart that leads the head. Understanding the market. Now, this is perhaps self-explanatory maybe, but I think as an industry, we've had a tendency to produce something first and then work out where to sell it. We need to make sure we're market-led. We need to work out whether we can produce something cost-effectively that the market wants and rewards. One key thing I think is having a mindset for change and innovations. And one of the things I'm certainly looking forward to post-lockdown is getting along to different events, visiting some different farm businesses and picking up some new ideas and fresh inspiration. Now, look, don't get me wrong. Digital content has been great, including a wealth of stuff from AHDB colleagues, but experience has taught me that I learn most from getting out onto other farms and seeing what's been done in practice. Now, I think it helps if we view the farm as a business and view profitability as a key objective. That statement sounds blindingly obvious to people outside our industry, but we know people farm for many reasons, and profit might not always be top of the list. We also know that we need to focus on details. There's no silver bullet in any of this, and preparing for some of the changes that are coming our way. This is all about incremental improvements. It's all about continual development. Those are the things that are going to deliver. Now, as farmers, I think we need to be prepared to operate in a more volatile and uncertain world, one where there's more competition and where that safety net offered by policy is disappearing. And I'm not even sure it's about adapting to the new norm, because I think we're going to be in a world where where we need to prepare for and plan for continual change and adaptation. The pace of change is only accelerating.
Excellent. Thank you. Rob, if you can give us a quick synopsis of your sort of take-home messages before we get stuck into the debate, please.
Just want to thank the two speakers there. Two great examples of immense change and uncertainty, and particularly the massive change that you had in New Zealand that we are starting to get a taste of in the UK regards government policy change, and of course Phil's crucial points about communications and really understanding where we are as a business. What I want to talk about and really put forward the challenge, if you're going to stay on the curve, you've got to be an uncertainty expert. And I really want to fire that out there. There's three areas that I think we could look at. It's first of all, understanding why we might be scared of something, why we are fearful. And secondly, dealing with the unknown. What is that? How do we overcome that? And finally, third is how do we build a future by reimagining all of this? I mean, the biggest issue here is really understanding uncertainty, because as Phil says, there is going to be an accelerating version of this, not a decelerating. Trying to make uncertainty certain doesn't work. Getting used to certain uncertainty is the way forward. There's a whole range of things we could talk about here, and I want to get stuck into the debate like everybody else. But one of the things we've got to avoid is falling into our classic defensive habits of trying to protect who we are and being open to that change in a way that we've never used to before in our industry. I come from a horticultural sector, brought up on a farm, growing strawberries, as already mentioned in the bio, but we had no subsidies. Actually, we didn't even own the farm, we were tenants. So every year we had immense uncertainty, no government protection and no land to remortgage if we had a bad harvest. So this is the world we're moving to now, is this accelerating change. There's a whole range of things we could go into, but one of the things you can avoid is getting into this fight or flight mode, where, as I said, you can be defensive. And looking at it in a very positive way. One of the things that we do within the AgTech community that I've created is create collaborative groups where we work in groups of between 6 and 8 businesses, where everybody works together in a confidential, closed-door environment. So this collaboration, which I think both the previous speakers were sort of touching on, is how we can really think together and overcome our challenges and problems. And we do this on an international basis. We cover all 5 continents in our groups, and we're very excited about it from around the world. One of the problems we have in our brain, and let's try and be a little bit psychotherapy for a moment, is that we are genetically wired to be negative. This is how caveman stopped dying. He watched his neighbor eat a berry that poisoned him, so he decided not to eat that berry anymore. It's how he avoided going to a part of a country around him which had animals that ate him or her. And this negative bias has protected us, but at the same time, it actually feeds this spiral of doom because we're constantly seeing bad stuff. And I really want to look at the other way around and think about how can we see good stuff? And there are tools and things we can do that. Now's not the time to go into too much detail on it. But really, what the most exciting space we're working in is ag tech, and seeing how that has a massive transformative change to overcoming, for instance, the points that were made about communications and having genuine transparency and traceability, but in a highly efficient digitalized way, or huge productivity gains by new leaps in technology that's being used on farm, conforming ourselves with much more aligned with consumer thinking around how we actually farm. Now we've got to be very honest with ourselves. If we're going to lead this world and have this opportunity, which is absolutely at our door, to change and be seen as the good guys, not the bad guys in the world around us, then we've really got to see how we can open up, and with that, really deal with the criticism that might come with that. Now, it seems almost, you know, you've got to be careful. Some people say Pandora's box, and, you know, be careful what you wish for. But if you want to avoid some major changes that are already happening around eating behavior and preferences, then really think hard about starting to open up and start to be really clear about what people don't want to see and how they have their food produced, because that's crucial. Because at the end of the day, eating is an agricultural act, and without that eating, we won't have an agricultural act. There's loads of things I'd love to talk about, but I don't think we've got time today. But one thing I would like to say is that if we can embrace uncertainty and become uncertainty experts, and rather trying to make uncertainty certain, see it as a good thing and power us forward in a positive, collaborative way, think openly, think in a way that we work together across the planet, not just as one nation and one place, and then really see how we can align ourselves with consumers that really want to believe in us as food producers. I hope that's a useful kickoff, and at least gets the debate going, and look forward to exploring this in much more detail. Thank you again for this opportunity to talk today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Jeff, for those great insights. Let's now get into the meaty part of this evening and start this lively debate. As we mentioned earlier, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Stick your hand up using the hand up function, or put your camera on, and we'll bring you into the debate. Likewise, if you want to use the chat function, please do use the chat function. And put some questions in there, and we'll try and utilise that. And if it's for a specific panelist, please could you mention that? So let's get kicked off. I've got one submitted question from someone that's unfortunately not with us this evening. He sent his apologies, but a very interesting question from Peter Green. It's to all panelists, and he said, what 3 things do the panel feel British farmers and growers need to improve upon in order to take a greater share of the value chain, whilst at the same time capitalising on the current public interest of food provenance and working towards reducing climate change? Who would like to kick us off? Go for it, Rob.
Okay, I've got to remember all 3 things. Yeah, it goes back to the level of engagement we can have. The closer the consumer can address, feel they're part of the farming process. And what I think the opportunity now with digitalization of supply chains is that we can create a dialogue. What we've had up to now is a monologue. And by that, I mean that we've had some marketing messages thrown at people, and that doesn't work anymore. That's what we used to do in the old days. Now we need to think about it as a dialogue. And with a dialogue, that means that they have to have a say in what we're doing. So I'm somewhat repeating myself from the previous speak, but if you want to genuinely have a value or be valued, then enable the consumers that you hope to buy your product to be part of that process. That's a crucial element. How you buy, we've seen in COVID that changed dramatically. Although I did predict this early on in lockdown that would switch back, and it is already starting to go back to more conventional routes, because frankly, convenience is one of the most powerful reasons for buying, which is also worth remembering that convenience isn't necessarily cheap. So understand what is the cost of something is very important. We often use price as a weapon to win business. When to the very same people that we're selling to are covered in brands, be it what they wear, what they drive, what they do. And those brands will be highly valued to them for lots of reasons, specific to them, no doubt. So really think about how we can get that brand messaging going to then get that across. And by the way, that does include the dialogue, because you don't really know what they want. Just simply telling them what you think they want is not the way forward. So, and then it comes down to collaborative selling. My background is horticulture, we said this, and that industry has grown 700% in the UK in the last 20 years to now a 1.6 billion New Zealand dollar business, that and whatever 800 million pound UK business just in strawberries alone, from a standing start of about 20 million just over 20 years ago. It's an incredible journey that's been achieved by farmers working together in a very professional way. So those are the three elements that I think are probably worth talking about.
Great, thank you, Rob. Jeff, did you want to, what were your thoughts? You're on mute. Sorry. Oh, should we go to Phil quickly? I think Jeff's just frozen.
Just to pick up on kind of what Rob said, I mean, around one aspect around the branding, I do think there's a big gap in terms of branding. If I roll back to I guess it must be 5 years or so now, when we had that kind of fake farms furore, and we all got worked up as an industry about using farmer brands to sell and position product. But you know, actually, let's look at ourselves. Where's been the genuine working together to help develop a brand and actually come up? Because we can, that was fake provenance. We're in a situation where we can genuinely do stuff. We see brand development all across the supermarket aisles. We don't really see it in fresh produce and red meat, really, unless we look beyond processed meats. I think on that broader aspect of food provenance, I think that's one of the areas that does give us the opportunity, but we do need to take a bit of a reality check. Just because it's British, don't expect a premium. I think increasingly features, provenance does increasingly feature in kind of why shoppers buy when surveyed, but when you actually ask them at the point of purchase, it's shifted down the list again. Think through the attributes that actually make us unique. And the other bit I think around kind of provenance is we probably automatically start to think about a price premium. Now, I think that's a tough ask when there's so many potential sellers. Maybe there's other more realistic benefits that we can tap into as farm businesses, maybe more around longer term supply. Maybe it's more around kind of new product development or joint development, stuff that leads more to relationships rather than that transaction focus. And that all brings us to kind of building in the value and the price. A couple of other things that I think are important, Mark. I'm always going to kind of bang on about data. That's kind of inherent in me in terms of the role that I do. But look, know where you are. Data is important and helps you understand how you measure up, and that will help signpost you to areas to focus on. I think there's always a big onus in terms of trying to do everything at once. That for me feels like it's a huge challenge with so much going on inside our farm businesses. The third opportunity, and that was kind of in there in the question around climate change. I think it's shifting up the agenda, but it's a complex and it's a really confusing issue for many people, consumers and farmers alike. Just one of the things that I found having kind of tried to work through the carbon footprint of the family farm recently, and the beef enterprise that we've got here, it was a bit of a headache to do it. The interesting bit was all the stuff that I'd done for measuring the financial performance and the physical performance meant that I could start to fill in some of the environmental aspects. And I think whatever our views on environmental challenges, it's coming down the line. I look at retailers' commitments around helping net zero. I look at others in the food supply chain. So whether you do or don't supply some of those businesses, I think it feels like it is coming our way. And Rob, before we started, we were talking just briefly about COP26. Expect a bigger focus on agriculture and the food chain's environmental impact later in the year.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Rob, for those two comments. We seem to have lost Jeff, unfortunately. I don't think his internet router has had its Weetabix yet this morning, but we'll keep going, and he's going to join us as quickly as he can. So we've got another question that's come in. We've got John Moss, which I think John might actually be on the call this evening. John is based down in Cornwall, and he says there's an arable farming a sustainable option in the UK without support and subsidies, or under the new environmental payment scheme? If so, what are the panel's recommendations? And we'll bring Jeff in to give some experience when he comes back on in terms of his experience of going through that. Who would like to have a go answering that?
Oh, simple answer from me is yes, but it's tough. I think when I start looking at some of the figures from arable sector performance, particularly in recent years, you start taking away the revenue or the income that has gone to farm businesses from the basic payment scheme, and it starts to create one or two challenges, I think, for quite a large number of arable businesses. What I can recommend is we've got a business impact calculator on the AHDB website, so you can put in your current level of BPS and see what the phase out is going to look like in the next few years. We also know that there's a big difference in terms of the the top 25% and the bottom 25% in performance, and those differences add up. There's about 100 grand difference when it comes to profitability, and I think there's how we respond to the challenges is going to be interesting. I think one of the issues on arable, we will probably start to see some of the more marginal land squeezed out. I'm conscious if we kind of roll back, and Jeff was talking about the kind of 1980s when he was talking about New Zealand. I suppose what we saw through the 80s and into the early 90s was land that would have been typically livestock. We saw some of that bought into arable production. Maybe not the best quality land, but the numbers stacked up. I can see some of that being squeezed in the years in future. I can see that kind of focus that we're going to need in terms of the cost base. I think inevitably there will be some sort of scale, and I wonder if from an arable sector, where we've exported product before, we've been used to putting grain on boats and shipping a commodity. I'd like to think our aspiration as an industry is how do we export container loads of added value product.
Excellent, thank you for that, Phil. What about yourself, Robs? Particularly drawing on that point that the strawberry industry, where your roots set from, have driven from 20 million to 800 odd million in terms of growth. What are your thoughts in terms of the arable sector, farming beyond the single farm payment and BPS?
Well, the strawberry industry benefited from the producer organisational schemes, which is an EU initiative where they did get help, but it was by way of meeting criteria and collaborative working together. So there was a level of EU glue there to make people do that. So there was money to help, but that now is within the hands of the UK government. We'll see what happens with all that money. I guess it's a really difficult thing. If you're used to that money coming in, you do change behaviour. But if you're not now used to that money, then that's going to the change is there. And the last sort of few years of farming for me, we were starting to get the area payments, and it was the first thing we could put in the budget. We knew it was as likely to come in as the rent for the farm cottage that we might have had, which is daft, as that wasn't the way to have it. So we really did kid ourselves here. And I know it's probably not easy to hear this, and it's probably desperately important for a whole range of people. But we can't expect the taxpayer to fund this. And I think this awakening is essential. Look what happened to New Zealand. Now there were some tragedies there as well, I'm sure. But I think the key is really rethinking the supply chain. There are vast inefficiencies that exist in the supply chain, vast. And what sorry to bang on about the ag tech and food tech drum here, but there are amazing leap, 10 times more levels of efficiency being achieved, and while at the same time being more environmentally friendly. All of this is aligned with the consumer thinking. So finding ways to actually produce a product with higher levels of productivity without at the cost of essentially welfare or environment. And this is a really exciting future, something that I think is very positive. The biological treatments that are happening, the data, the big data processing. I'm sure, as an example of a company such as Breeder, I'm sure Phil will know about Breeder. It's an Australian guy that moved over here, and he's developed an amazing system to improve efficiency gains in beef, and is now rolling that out to other sectors within the industry. There are technologies here that actually aren't, because the customer doesn't know what it costs. They just know what they pay for it. They don't know what it costs. So what matters is we get that right. And so I think we just have to get used to the fact that it's not the taxpayer's job to fund this industry, really, unless we want to be environmental, unless we want to have a type of farming that we can't do profitably, and that's when we've really got a problem. But my view is that we should address many of the productivity issues that we've got, and be honest about that, rather than thinking things can't change, because they can.
Excellent. We've got Jeff back. We're very glad to see you there, Jeff, and we could see the smile on Mark's face when he came back on We're just talking about subsidies, so and so that's imminently disappearing over here. So what's the lessons from New Zealand around subsidies and how farmers can and should adapt their businesses around that?
Well, firstly, I think the biggest thing is that the climate for change in terms of the subsidy program through the UK is quite significant. So the benefits you have are, firstly, that in my view, the UK farming industry is similar to New Zealand in the sense that you're in a very good climatic area, you're close to the markets, so therefore the opportunities are pretty good. If you look on a macro level, the first thing is really important, and I think Rob mentioned it before the internet went down in New Zealand, that the creativeness of shortening that supply chain is quite critical. And that's, even though we have a distance tyranny issue for New Zealand, there's huge effort at the moment is just to keep continuing to reduce that supply chain. And the big thing then on farm is just about your costs and the way you operate, and ensuring you're producing a product or a commodity in an area that best suits the market. Because it seems to me, one of the things we found here in New Zealand, as you've seen in recent times, a big change to dairy, is that a lot of farming practices were just done because that was traditional. They'd been from one farm generation to the next. When in actual fact, the type of product that you want to produce or the type of production you may want to do on your farm could be different to what it is currently.
Jeff, I've got a question from my perspective. You mentioned about people got back on fertilizer kind of in the mid-80s, soon as subsidies went. What else? What happened in terms of rents? What happened in terms of farm machinery? Because those for me feel like the big outgoings. And I guess if from a livestock perspective, actually scaling back your fertilizer and maybe managing lower grass growth is potential much harder to do on cereals and arable production for us in the UK.
So one of the, I think the most common comment made in New Zealand in the 80s that most farmers had a rust disease, and that was that they couldn't help themselves in terms of continually wanting to have new machinery on their farms. And so that was just the first thing is similar to fertilizer. When you start to try and reduce about 30 or 40% of cost out of the business, you just had to look at quite dramatic changes. So if that meant keeping a tractor or the header or anything for another 2 seasons, that's what you did in order to get through that. Deferred maintenance is not a good proposition in the long term, but you can get away with it for a couple of years while you adjust. In terms of look, the genetics and the improvement in terms of pastures and the technology around some of the grazing systems, they took a period of 5 to 10 years. Probably the first 5 was just people testing different ways than they did on their farms. The second 5 was just an improvement in the technology that you found that worked really well on those properties. The other is farm discussion groups started to develop in New Zealand. They used to be run by the government. So you had a math tech sort of, and that sharing of information became quite a big thing. Restructuring of the industry organisations, so the similar to AHDB or our ones here, changed quite dramatically to become farmer-orientated, research-based industry good organisations, and that changed the focus quite significantly. But probably the biggest thing is just tenacity. People believing and be passionate about their product and hanging in there to get through the other side. I think you're in a much better position in terms of the transition in the UK. You're not seeing 17.5% interest rates, and as I said before, you're much closer to a market. We would love to have a market of 400 million people just next door.
Any comments on that? And so we've just voted what is going to be the the short and medium term future of that market. you've been over here for a while, Jeff, and working on trade deals. And what do you think Britain's position is going to be?
Look, one of the things I've really noticed post Brexit and the exit from the EU is a sort of reawakening for the international markets to understand the size of the UK market. Because it was part of the EU, was never talked about being the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. And that understanding of the size of the UK market by other countries, the reality is we have to have a trade deal with the UK. It's not whether we want to or not. It's just fundamental in terms of our future. So I do agree with the current administration's sort of view is that there are a lot of countries that will want to be trading with you. And the advantages the UK has is, firstly, it's got a strong financial system. It has a strong historical exporting, and it's well known for its standards. So in terms of the Asian market, I think the huge growth there over the next two decades is a real opportunity. I think for your lamb, North America is a real opportunity in terms of the future. So in most of the other commodities, though, look, we just see Asia. New Zealand's in a position now where 40% of our exports go to China. Now, some people would say that's a risk. If you're a Canadian farmer, 95% of your exports go to the US. I think that's a much greater risk. So for us, while we're shifting into the South Asia markets and now looking at Africa and India, look, the North Asian market is the growth for the next decade.
I'm interested in that because if I think back to when I was working for the US Department of Agriculture, I was helping American businesses target the UK and always had that conversation with them about accessing the UK market's a real challenge. Why are you doing it? And it was issues around, well, we know we're going to get paid typically because the business infrastructure is good and it's preferable to doing business in other parts of the world where it's harder ultimately to get paid or default. Yeah, there might be some high standards, but they're not changing all the time. There's some clear transparency. It's a high value market where there's high income. Let's not kid ourselves that other countries around the world are targeting the UK and are keen to access it. I'm really interested in terms of what the prospects are for British exports, and particularly around that high value end. And again, let's kind of not kid ourselves that we're ever going to be a net exporter on the scale of Australia, New Zealand, or USA. However, there are added value opportunities. I'm quite envious, I think, when I look at the resources that the likes of New Zealand, Australia, and the US put into some of that export promotion and that activity. Actually having people on the ground in overseas markets to help with local knowledge, build contacts, troubleshoot stuck shipments, to lobby domestic regulations. It's that support network is there, and I think if we're serious in the UK about tapping into export opportunities, and there are export opportunities, we also need to make sure that framework's in place. I'm not sure we've quite got it yet. We've got one person in the embassy in China that is a significant part of that is funded by AHDB. We need government departments to make sure that they're kind of backing up some of the rhetoric that is being talked about now around global Britain, from my perspective. Excellent.
Rob, you want to jump in there? Colin, yeah. I'll bring you in a second before your arm gets tired. I said you've been holding up your arm, but we'll bring you in straight after this.
Yeah, I mean, I've travelled a lot in US as well, and seeing a lot of British products on the shelves throughout all the states I went through there many times, and been very proud to see great British products on the shelves there. But Phil's right. It is a tough gig to get serious volume out there. Some of the products that we've got there have worked, but the sheer issue, the biggest issue we've seen from brands I've worked with exporting into, say, the US particularly, unlike Europe actually, but more so for US, it's been understanding their supply chain and really getting to grips with the model that they have, which is very different to ours. Incidentally, it's actually the reverse of the way around. Our model here is tough too, for, and I'm sure Kiwi farmers would be scratching their heads about that too, because it's a very, very tough market either way. But it's really getting to that intelligence, and I'm told that we've gone from 40 to 800 staff in the DIT on this. So to give you an idea of commitment, I hope that is sincere, the showing teeth there. But the bottom line is knowing that market, getting under the skin of it, and learning what works for that market is key. End of the day, actually, a currency change, as I have done trading in my sales around the world, can be a far bigger factor than any duty. Isaac, as somebody that I sort of business in South Africa, I certainly experienced that in one instance, and lost the business in 18 months just because of a weakening pound and a strengthening rand. So it's amazing what can happen, but it is about really getting to. I think the key thing is really knowing how things work, and not being flippant about that, because just because you've got a good product, people should buy it. And this is a really obvious thing to say, but doing your homework and using the resources that are out there. That's me.
Thanks, Rob. Right, Colin's has got his hand up. Colin, do you want to come in, just introduce yourself very quickly and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Colin Bateman. I'm on the beef and lamb sector board. I just wanted to ask Jeff, actually. I mean, I think, in the UK, in the pasture-based sector, we've got quite an opportunity, because we've got a bit of a template from what's already taken place in New Zealand, and that can be implemented quite quickly. But I want to ask you about collaboration between farmers, which is something that we really have a bit of a historical problem with in the UK. I'm wondering how long it took farmers to realise that they needed to cooperate with each other, and develop that kind of mindset change to get more involved in the chain, vertically as well as actually horizontally across farms and potentially across sectors.
Excellent question. Thanks, Colin. You're on mute, Jeff. You're on mute, Jeff.
Thanks, Colin, for your question. Officially, I have to say that we're still fiercely competitive when we go to the pub. And so we don't always collaborate. I think two big drivers happened. Firstly was that the government agencies prior to subsidies used to provide a lot of free advice, and it was often treated accordingly, and of not much value or use. So right to the extent that fertilizer tests could be done on your farm and it was paid for, and farmers never used them. So once we started to commercially have to recognise cost, that changed the way farmers looked at things. And also the big change came in the second part, was just that where there was the trialling of new systems or mechanisms in terms of pasture production or genetics or etc., farmers found that farm discussion groups, especially in the 90s, but in the late 80s and early 90s, was probably the most productive area. So in all the surveying done about where farmers got information from farming magazines through to the radio, through the local veterinary practice, the stock agents, everything, it was interesting. The most sensible way of shifting technology or information was by putting farmers up in front of farmers rather than scientists in front of scientists. Farmers found we had quite a big monitor farm field system developed in the sheep and beef industry, as an example, where you get 400 or 500 farmers at a field day. What we learned quite quickly is that putting somebody up that hadn't actually physically tried or experienced what you were talking about in terms of development never always worked, and putting farmers in front of farmers really does.
I just about that up, Isaac. I mean, I kind of said it in the pre-recorded piece, but when Colin, it's one of the things that I think works really well for us at AHDB is all the stuff we do around Monitor Farms, the Farm Excellence Network. I don't think I've been to one where I haven't come away with an idea or it's really stimulated my thinking. And it's one of the things I'm really looking forward to is getting out and about, because it, you know, the jargon we talk about, knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer, actually what we're doing is we're learning from other people's mistakes and we're pinching their ideas. And actually it's if, as I said in the piece, as great as webinars are, I've really missed going out on farm, really missed it.
Excellent. David, we've got an interesting question from David Hoyle in the chat. So before we get to that one, I'm just going to tie in with the current conversation. I've had a pre-submitted question from Andy Stevens, some block carver in Oxfordshire area, saying conventional agriculture is facing great change. How can it be kept based on good science and, you know, some farm practice rather than rushed political gestures? Wry smile from you there, Jeff.
Look, this is something that, like all industries, we're facing all the time. And I come from a very strong belief in science-based application, but the reality is perception, consumer values and demand, and then science is really the way you're facing it. And most of this is from social media. So the direct sourcing of information rather than through a third party is changing the values and the interests in regard of the consumer about what they're seeing. If we first experienced in the Japanese market, where this would be 20 years ago, where the individual demand about traceability of animals back to the farm was quite a shock for New Zealand industry. We collectively sent animals to the plant and got them killed. So that changed it. I think you have to accept that when you're dealing with the consumer, you're dealing with them in three aspects. That's their value, their perspective, and then the science, without any change. Look, the biggest driver now for us is shifting into blockchain and direct mail order, but especially in the Chinese market, but more so in Taiwan, Korea, Japan. And what we're learning there is the consumer is wanting stuff straight away in terms of that information. And what blockchain is doing is allowing us to do that at a very cheap cost.
Rob, you're keen to get in there.
Yeah, I totally see that, and that's at one end of what they call downstream or consumer facing. Totally right, Jeff. What we're seeing with some technologies is extraordinary levels of productivity gains, but essentially the critical part here is that we're moving from conventional treatments, let's go NPK and other pesticides and fungicides from, you know, synthesized sources, to biologicals. And what we now need is different tactics around farming. I'm going to get down the agenda of conversation tonight, but the key is that we're looking at different ways of farming that create tactics rather than, if you like, chemicals. And those tactics require a massive amount of data, because the different ways of doing things, combined with when it happened and where it was in the UK, to the weather that moment and the weather previously, all of that coming together is the way to then bring in good science into the way to deal with the future of farming. So the question about how to make it good science is moving away from anecdotal, if you like, as Phil said, leading from the heart, which is important. Passion is good, but actually the science will be the head. And what we're working with is businesses where they're developing new ways of understanding the data and processing it in a way that's never imagined. We're taking inspiration from other industries like financial services or fintech, and seeing how they're massively changing through machine learning and artificial intelligence, which was seen as a sort of almost like a Jackanory made-up thing, is now really starting to happen. And we're seeing some extraordinary benefits. Simple example, in plant breeding, we're looking at 80% reduction in plant breeding timescales purely by good data science. And that's a massive impact on near market selling for better progeny, but also far, far more efficient to produce. But that's my point. So we're seeing this big data play that is starting to come for real, and but does need decent ways of measuring it. And I think moving away from guesswork and more to specific, really good, accurate systems is the way forward.
Yeah, so dead right, Rob, because the idea of us having the time or ability to take a trial and error approach and learn as we go along, we haven't got time for that. And that evidence-based decisions. And I suppose I want to know from a farming perspective. I want to know whether something works. I want to know how what the cost of it's going to be, and I really want to know that before I make that investment. And I think there's a number of issues where we're still lacking in terms of that information.
One of the things I noticed in the UK was the level of research done at a Harper Adams was a good example for me, where there was a lot of stuff done on robotics, and I could never, funded by the government, and I could never understand why the funding of research was entering into a commercial area which is being researched around the world. We've changed quite significantly in the last couple of decades to where the government funding is in the areas where there is industry failure. So it's in the pure genetics, the data and that sort of stuff. That's where we do the research, rather than where I saw quite a bit of what I would term competitive research being done from government institutions, which I really couldn't understand as a concept in agriculture.
Oh, Jeff, you've got me on my hobby horse now. So this is the second time I've talked about this today. But kind of if I look at some of the research and development that has gone on in our industry, in the wider food industry, a lot of it is driven by, some of it's government funded, but it's done in academia. What is the focus of the people that are doing the research? It's not about focusing on the issues where the biggest problems are or that deliver the potential biggest benefits. It's not about producing genuine insight and recommendations that can be put into practice and make change in the industry. It's about researching something, publishing a paper, and probably trying to get the next tranche of funding. That R&D pipeline has been broken. Now, I think there's some considerable efforts that have been put together to try to reconnect it. Some of the agri-tech centres that we've got in this country are doing a really strong job in terms of that. But that R&D pipeline has just been it's needed to be rebuilt. And actually the future for me, I think, is more around kind of public-private partnership, rather than kind of looking across for some big funder to come and do the work for us.
So we've had a pre-submitted question from Matt Keeley on exactly this thing. So his question were, given the consolidated supply chains within the UK ag industry, do the panel think it is difficult for farmers to adopt these new technologies? And is that mainly due to innovators unable to access and make money at farm gate level? So it's and maybe that's contrary to what you're just saying. And then secondly, do the panel feel there's a tangible government support for both innovators and farmers? So on the numerous agri-tech opportunities. So it's, I guess that almost goes in opposite what you just said.
Well, last year, Innovate UK put 400 million into research. Value for money will be something we can all debate another time, I guess. But what we are seeing is immense change around academic meeting commercial opportunities. In fact, Lincoln University has 60 PhDs working on robotics, and those they are developing some incredible areas of science. So I think this is changing. So and we've been asked recently to help, for instance, NIAB, which is the National Institute of Botany and Agriculture, if anybody is not aware of that, down in Kent, to help them potentially create an incubator. Now, we're early days of discussing with that, but by that we will be a commercial entity helping them scale with their academic thinking. So the whole journey of combining private and public sector is happening, and we're very excited about to be meeting a number of those around the country. There's over 100 ag tech facilities and institutions around the UK to develop ideas.
You want to add anything to that, Jeff? And Phil, in a minute. What where do you see who's?
Can I say that one of the things that the UK is really good at, and that is that fundamental research and the capacity around the ability to do some of the work in especially robotics, but more so in drones, etc., is going to be a big leap in terms of the productivity of agriculture.
Phil, did you have anything?
Yeah, I suppose when I think about it from a DEFRA angle and come at it from that, I think, yeah, kind of I take Rob's point actually about some of the phenomenal focus that has been added as a result of Innovate UK and then some of the kind of support and focus that has that's come in that is changing stuff. But it feels to me the government focus, well, certainly from DEFRA right now, is around environment. It's around that public money for public goods mantra. And I suppose from my perspective, it just feels a little bit short-sighted. More productive businesses have a lower environmental impact. So why wouldn't you help farm businesses get more productive in the process? And you know, it's part of a win-win focus. And you know, politicians love double whammies. For me, feels like one that they've potentially missed. The other bit about the public-private partnerships, I think, is and why I see more of it in future. Well, look, I suppose AHDB for me is an asset in that pre-competitive space, has been when it comes to research. But I think the future is more about supply chains investing in the tech and working with their suppliers that give them a competitive edge, which actively drives value and gets them and their suppliers the payback.
Brilliant. Thanks for those answers. It's really interesting. We could
Good.
talk about ag tech all evening, but that ties in what you just said, Phil, into David Hoyle's question, which he's asking: by 2040, please can the panel rank the importance of water availability, soil health, and automation? Who'd like to go first? Go for it, Rob.
It's one of those questions that you can never answer, really, because if you haven't got any water, you haven't got anything. But then if you haven't got soil health, you haven't got anything either. So, but we're immersed in soil health challenges and issues that within our people we're meeting. I think that one of the greatest productivity gains we're going to have is really understanding soil health and how we can then really reduce our costs, our inputs as a result of that. There's some examples where actually people are removing their inputs entirely by better soil health, i.e. £500 a hectare equivalent per year. So soil health is fundamental. It should be an insurance scheme for climate change. So in fact, so for me, it's soil health, then it's water, but it'd be water, it'd be water how it's looked after when there's too much of it, when there's not enough of it, and that will be a result of soil health, because good soil health will retain water in droughts and also be a sponge when there's too much. And automation, I'm not sure about automation. I think there's a long way to go on automation. So it has to be third for me.
Excellent, thank you, Rob. Phil, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think Dave, I'd take them in the order that David's got them, but kind of take Rob's point about water and soil health being overlapped. And I think the reason that I put water at the top of the list is just because of the variation that we're seeing in terms of weather patterns. When I look at some of the forecasts and predictions for climate change, it seems like what we're gonna see. We're going to be a part of the world which potentially could be a little bit wetter, but it tends to be that we're going to see more extremes. So the idea of us being able to get the rain when we want it, well, yeah, kind of maybe April bottomed that out with just how cold and dry it was, and then just think about how much rain we had in May. Well, yeah, I'm sure kind of, you know, Colin's part of the world, they probably had as much rain in May as they expect in the middle of winter.
Jeff, you're on mute, but and you're also part of the governance of land and water reforms in New Zealand. So what's your take on this?
So look, I'm a bit like Rob. I'm on the soil health first, because you can't shift the soils too far, and whereas water you can. So and probably for New Zealand, and similar to probably Australia and other countries, is that we still don't know a lot about our soils, and I'll explain that a little bit in a moment. Then, so for water, look, 94% of the water we get here in New Zealand goes to sea. So water storage is quite a big issue in terms of the future here, and that's quite a difficult debate in this whole sustainable argument. But there's a lot of work being done on that. And in terms of, well, I often use AI as probably the best example. artificial intelligence is being sort of prompted to us as being the next big break. I think it's a little bit like experimental areas where the jump's probably a wee bit further than we think. So we're really good at collecting data. We haven't really learned how to mine that data in a way that gives us quick benefits. So the reason for those three. The interesting work that's been done in New Zealand is that we're starting to find in some of the science on soils is that the porous gravelly soils are actually doing less damage to the rivers than what we would have called the old peat or the heavy soils. Now, this is completely contrary to where internationally the work's understood. And this is to do with, depending on where the aquifers are and depth, is that often these gravelly soils are better at pulling out the nitrates, etc., on the way through. And so there's quite a bit of work done in New Zealand now to try and get out of long-term rules and regulations about sustainability of water and water quality by understanding landscapes. And that is on your farm, being able to map. Most of this is by radiography. It's taken out of the mineral industry. And you can understand the stratas under your soil to the extent you'll be able to tell by putting 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on this soil, this is the impact it will have on your waterways or your drains. But if you put it on this part of your farm, the impact is 50% less. What the initial work is showing is that on an average sheep and beef farm of around 200 hectares, there is probably 40 to 50% of the property that does have no impact at all on the environment by the current practices. But if you loaded the other 50%, you have a significant damage to the environment. And it's not necessarily right beside waterways and everything. So this, for us is quite significant. You have to understand that 45% of our gases in New Zealand are methane in terms of our total calculation. So you can imagine farmers are getting a fair thumping around this in terms of climate change.
Brilliant. Thanks for those answers, and hopefully that answers your question, David. So we're just going to kind of change the tact a little bit and move across to a bit more about leading others. And we've had a couple of questions come in. One first is from Ian Smith from Bedfordia Farms, and he's asking, building resilience within a small team that has seen little change in years, what useful tools and ideas would the panel share about how you could embed this with the change that we're facing in the UK? Jeff or Phil? Phil, any ideas?
Oh, so from my perspective, I suppose particularly when we've seen kind of minimal change, and we maybe have, if we look back over long term in agriculture versus kind of looking ahead, we have seen much more volatility in agricultural commodity markets since 2007-8, and I remember being at cereals that year, and the price of wheat actually kind of, I think it went up by about £4 a ton between day one and day two, and that was kind of almost unheard of, that sort of movement. But markets move faster. I mean, the obvious, I mean, I kind of come back, and maybe it's the economist in me, but I come back to that scenario planning and trying to work through the what ifs, trying to look at the future and work back. One of the things that we've actually got on the AHDB website as well, we've got a business resilience checklist. So trying to look at look at yourself in terms of some of the key things that we think are important for farm businesses around the kind of continual development, the focus on people, the more effective use of data, how you expose yourself to innovation and new ideas, how you take inspiration from others. So that's maybe a kind of useful starting point in terms of that checklist. I think for me, it also comes back down to make sure we are kind of trying to focus on what's in our control. And as an industry, we spend a lot of time and effort complaining about what we can't influence. And as much as I might or might not be particularly happy with trade deals that have been announced today, it's not within my gift to influence them. What I can focus on is my farm business and how that is performing. So yeah, I think it's always a challenge. I think particularly in terms of dealing with any sort of change, and it kind of comes back actually to kind of what Rob was talking about at the outset and kind of his opening thoughts, because this is about how we face up to change and how we prepare for it. It's not just a shift to a new normal and things will go back and calm down. Change for me is going to be permanent.
Great, thank
Jeff,
you.
You guys had to learn to be quite resilient. You're on mute. You're on mute, Jeff.
Got it this time. Look, one of the things I've often said to children as they've grown up, who are now some in agriculture and some not, but two things you won't get taught at university. One is how to be a parent, and the second one is how to manage people. And for the agriculture sector, the ability to provide resilience in your business by giving good leadership was seen back in the 80s and 90s as an HR department in a corporate somewhere. It wasn't seen as part of your farm plan. Whereas now, today, I think, especially in the dairy industry, but even in sheep and beef, properties that are employing more than one or two people have put a lot more resource into that. How do you keep resilience within your business? And the key piece of resilience is your staffing, because the cost of losing staff or changing staff is fundamental. And that's been a big growth area, is people understanding how to manage people, how to work with people in a way to make your business grow. And it's now not uncommon, to hear of, farm managers doing 15 years on a property, whereas back in the 80s, you're probably lucky to have them for 3.
I think that's a very good point. As part of the Agri-Leader program, Mark and I have been looking at and how we roll that out further and casting that net wider and getting everybody involved in leadership and management development. And a quote that I quite like is, "You don't need a title to be a leader." And again, I think that everybody needs to get involved with that and be much more open to that, rather than just the technical side of farming. Yeah. It's the people management and being very important.
Rob, have you got any thoughts, particularly coming from the horticulture and the strawberry sector, how you can bring a team, small or large, through change?
I've worked in all the sectors with from retail to farm to retail, supply chain. It's always been about people. It was interesting that I took over the commercial side of the farm when I was 20, and primarily because we were employing, which was a lot in those days, but not now, but sort of 300 to 500 people a year. Now, there was a time when my father could tell people what to do, and they just did it. How high should they jump? But even then he learned that people needed to be talked to in a way that he couldn't understand. This was a generational thing, and I think I guess I've been one of the things I've been immersed in is how to build leaders within a business that are aligned with your thinking as the sort of the leader. And that ultimately, one of the biggest mistakes I think I see in business is that you treat people like as if you'll put a sat nav on their head and they follow the automatic route, and they don't have no idea. Like all of us, when we use a sat nav, we get to a destination, no idea how we got there because the thing told us what to do. And yet actually, if we had a way that we enabled them to find their way there, providing they get to the place we want to get there, how they get there doesn't matter. And that's the beginning of leadership, because they can start to think through and remember why they turn left or right in this metaphor. And it's one of the most key things. So it's a compass rather than sat nav. The more we tell people what to do, the more we try and control them, the less they'll be leaders, because they can't be, they're conforming. They're being robots, essentially. And rethinking that, enabling people to think for themselves, is the way forward. And that worked from running a farm shop with 30 people to a large farming business to just distribution businesses. So the same thinking all the time. Enable people to think for themselves within the parameters that work within the overall business, but let them get on with it. Don't get in the way, providing they don't kill themselves, hopefully, or anybody else in the process. That's the idea.
I think it's interesting that, Rob, because it's one thing I think we've historically struggled with as an industry has kind of been that kind of consistent skills and investment and that pathway for careers, and it's been quite short term and quite focused. I think that's something increasingly which is rising up the agenda, and there's a wealth of those. Well, wealth is maybe overstating it, but kind of more and more of those development opportunities. But it's all about how do you delegate responsibility, how do you empower teams in farm businesses to be able to do that, and that's really small in small farm businesses where getting off farm to take advantage of those learning opportunities and that skills development is inevitably going to be a tough call on for some farms.
And we're only on the edge of this because what's happening throughout the industry, particularly the ones that are very labour dependent, are getting absolutely hammered on a shortage of people. I mean, I'm based in London now, but there are restaurants that can't open at lunchtime because they can't get the people, let alone farms that have enough people that are treated like manual labour. So we've got to really think how we motivate people and actually want people to be part of this. The power, if you like, is very much with the people. So really getting our heads around this is not only critical, it's urgent. And because there'll be nobody on these farms to do the work that we need to get done. And yet it's a wonderful place to be, outside and being able to, being able to do things in the fresh air potentially is such a brilliant opportunity, particularly with the technologies combined with that. It's a gender-proof, age-proof industry now, by way of it doesn't require anything to be anybody from to be able to get on. And but that message needs to get out there. It is getting out there in horticulture. I'm not sure how far afield it's getting within the total farming industry, but certainly I know of the great initiatives being done around attracting young people into that industry. It's doing well. It needs to do a lot better, but it's made good progress. So we're on the edge unless something dramatically changes around availability of employment. Our reliance on unlimited supply of Eastern European labour to fulfil many jobs within farming is in serious jeopardy. There's been an 18% wage rise in food service industry in the last 12 months, 18%, and that's just the start of it. So we're some big changes here that we need to confront.
It's interesting, Rob, in New Zealand, exactly the same problem. So with predominantly Filipino in the dairy industry and the island people for the horticultural industry, started pre-COVID, but COVID has definitely caused that. There are some immigration changes here. I was at a meeting just yesterday, which was with some industry leaders in the southern part of the South Island, looking at trying to get some levers in the immigration area changed. We've got, especially in the dairy industry and the horticultural industry, contracting industry, looking at thousands short of labour for this coming season.
Right. So I'm just conscious of time, and doesn't it fly when you're having fun? So a couple of final questions from us to the panel. My first one there is, what indicators should the people on this call, the agri leaders, be keeping an eye on to make sure they stay ahead of the curve? What are the things they should be reading, should be watching, or should be listening to? Phil, I'll pick on you first.
Oh gosh, I kind of already kind of flagged some of the events that I'm looking forward to getting out to. There's a wealth of podcasts out there around kind of management experience. One of the things that I particularly value is something called Manager Tools, which is very American but also kind of global in its outlook. And Jeff kind of mentioned about the the kind of managing people, leadership of people, you can't teach it. I found that a really useful resource actually in terms of throughout my career over the last 10 years, and it's evolved. So it's kind of looking at people, really focusing on personality types. So outside of the kind of agricultural sphere that I'm assuming kind of people are quite familiar with a lot of the events and resources available, that's something I'd recommend as seeking out, and it's manager tools.
Rob?
Absolutely be a student. My Nuffield was in 2008, not 2018, by the way, in the bio. But yeah, get out of the office, be it your farm or your office, and travel and meet people. I was very privileged to meet amazing people from New Zealand and all over the world on that Nuffield Farming Scholarship. It was a great honour to be part of that. But equally, you don't have to do that. You could just simply get on with it. But actually, the most important thing on top of that is get out of the industry just to look at other industries. And if you're going to build a robot, I'd probably go to the automotive industry to find out how to build a robot. If I was going to go to the biological fertilizer industry, probably worth going into some. I'm trying to think what it would be, but it would be another industry that's not necessarily the obvious one. So I think it's changing where you are to look out and then back in again at where you are to solve those problems. That's how I developed my first business as an individual. I patented a strawberry system because I went into the tomato industry and saw what they're doing there and reinvented what then has now been changed the entire industry to nearly a £700 million industry. And it was that moment of serendipity. I saw something that was done elsewhere that could be useful here. So I think being a great student of what's happening now, don't waste time, always learning, and that doesn't stop even when you're a 51-year-old ex-strawberry farmer from Shropshire, and equally get out of your industry to go into other industries to reflect back on what they do that would be different. If you really want to find out what's going on, if you're going to do blockchain, go and talk to the fintech industry. They've been doing it for 15 years. There are people now who talk to me about it as if they've discovered fire. They haven't. Somebody else did 10 years ago. So just be aware of what's going on elsewhere. That is one of the most powerful things I think you can do, and then bring it back and make it happen into a real business here.
Jeff, what should people be reading, watching, listening to, or send your take-home message?
Well, to be honest, I'm not going to add much more to what Rob said. I totally agree. I just use the expression "get off the farm." If you looked at probably the toughest periods in New Zealand from about 1990 through to about 96, 97, if it was one, we had high suicide rates by that stage in New Zealand agriculture. The one thing we said to everybody, which became a bit of a thing, get off the farm. And I think the other thing that really helped too in terms of that is just having a look at with 2 or 3 mates rather than trying to do it on your own. Is just go away and have a look at some of the other industries and what they're doing. The fascinating thing that came through all that process though was a bit of pride and passion around the view in New Zealand agriculture was that actually we feed 40 million people and we're only a country of 5, and the realization if we didn't produce stuff, people would starve. And that's, I think there was an expression that developed in New Zealand was if you've eaten today, thank a farmer.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mark, I think back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That's we could probably go on for another hour or so, but I'm conscious of time. It's been a really interesting debate, and some of the key points that I've just noted down, some points that you made, Jeff, about not realising we're probably a bit blind in terms of realising how big the market is that we have access to in the UK and how big our market is with the 400 million customers on the doorstep, which we need to work on that. Then some of the points that Rob made right at the beginning around we can't get away from uncertainty, but we need to learn to adapt and change utilising technologies and all things down the track to continue driving business forward. And then some of the points that Phil made around understanding figures and numbers and knowing your costs, but also really understanding your market and where that market is going and adapting your business to be allocated to that market. But I think the big bit that I think we just dwelled on is never stop learning. Look outside of the business before you look inside the business, and just nick the good bits from what everyone else is doing outside of the industry and implement that in some way, shape or form onto a farm or into a growing unit. But what a great debate. Isaac, hand over to you to close off.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that summary and helping to facilitate tonight. Thanks also to Sarah and Sammy in the background and making sure Mark and I don't have to worry about all the tech happening in the background, and that's been very smooth. To Miriam for all of the communications before the event, so thanks to those guys. As always, we would really appreciate your feedback, so there should be in the chats and in a minute, and pop in a feedback form. If you can spend 5 minutes, just please filling that in, give us your feedback, tell us what we can do more of, what we can do different. That's invaluable for us. We'll also send it out via an email with the recording of tonight, so please give us your feedback. Like Mark said, and there we've got Talking Leaders launching on Thursdays, a TED type talk, so very informal, and with Tim Bradshaw. His thing is Because I Can, so he'll talk us through that, but a bit of this people leadership that we just talked about now, so please join us for that. Which leave me with just a final massive thank you to our panelists, Phil, Rob, Jeff. Thank you very much for joining us, but especially for our audience tonight. Thanks for the questions you've submitted. Thanks for joining us and keeping us on our toes. So thank you very much and have a very good evening. Thank you.